She had exactly one heartbeat to make her point: beg for mercy while surrounded by armed guards, or shatter the untouchable illusion of the man standing before her. Nyla Daniels stood panting beneath ornate chandeliers that illuminated the grand hall like a spotlight. Gold leaf shimmered in the periphery of her vision. Around her, men in dark suits lay groaning on the floor, men who were supposed to be the best security in Seoul. Silent, overwhelmed, broken. She should have been terrified. Any rational person would have dropped to their knees, surrendered, and prayed for a quick end. But as Lee Sok-jin's widened eyes settled on her, as his recoiling posture betrayed his shock, something inside Nyla ignited into a cold, lethal focus. All she could think about was proving that his power meant nothing against her precision. Survival, she'd learned, wasn't about begging. Sometimes it came with a lightning-fast kick and absolute control. Land a single hit, he had challenged, arrogant and amused. The room held its breath. Nyla pivoted on her back foot. In a blur of motion, she unleashed a strike that cut through the air like a blade. Her boot stopped millimeters from his nose. Gasps didn't ripple through the room. Silence did. Lee Sok-jin flinched. The man who made governments tremble was frozen. Nyla lowered her leg and smirked. "Now that I have your attention," she said, her voice steady amidst the chaos, "let's talk." Welcome back to the gallery. Stay with me till the end. Show some love by hitting like and subscribe. Comment where you're watching from, and you're absolutely amazing. Let's get into the story.
Nyla Daniels was a legend in the underground circuit when she vanished from the world. On paper, she was the Panther, a kickboxing phenomenon who disappeared without a trace. But what the fans didn't know was why she left. She was tracking a lead to the Obsidian Lotus. To the public, it was a high-end casino, a place of luxury and luck. But what no one told you was that the Obsidian Lotus wasn't really a casino. It was a fortress, the kind of place where gold leaf covered hushed crimes, where the Ilwa syndicate ruled, and where walking in uninvited was a death sentence. Before she even stepped through the doors, the whispers on the street had warned her. Don't ask questions, don't look for trouble, and if Lee Seok-jin is present, you run the other way. She should have stayed hidden. But her younger sister, Maya, didn't just run away. She was kidnapped, taken by the underworld. Nyla believed the syndicate was responsible. They said the Ilwa took what they wanted. They said no one crossed them and lived. Nyla knew better. She knew that fear was just another opponent to dismantle. So she tracked them. She honed her Muay Thai. She turned her body into a weapon and her grief into fuel. For months, she hunted the shadows, just a ghost searching for the only family she had left. Tonight, that ended, because Lee Seok-jin, the ruthless boss at the top, finally knew her face. And from the moment she chose to stop her kick an inch from his face instead of kicking him, Nyla Daniels stopped being a frantic sister. She became his secret weapon.
30 minutes before she became the woman with a boot to a mafia boss's throat, Nyla Daniels was just a shadow in the alleyway behind the Obsidian Lotus. The neon sign pulsed a sickly violet, reflecting off the damp pavement and the scarred leather of her jacket. She checked her knuckles, wrapped tight, ready for the impact she knew was coming. She didn't use the front door. The front door was for people with money and illusions. Nyla dealt in truth and trauma. She scaled the service ladder with the fluid grace of a predator, her boots making no sound against the rusted metal. Inside, the air changed, from the salt-heavy breeze of the harbor to the suffocating scent of expensive cigars and filtered oxygen. The first guard met her in the narrow corridor leading away from the kitchens. He was a mountain of a man in a black suit, his radio crackling with a mundane status update. Nyla didn't give him the chance to speak. She moved inside his reach before he could draw his baton, a sharp elbow to the solar plexus, followed by a knee that sent him into the realm of unconsciousness. She caught him before he hit the floor, easing his bulk down with a cold, practiced efficiency. "One down," she whispered, the image of Maya's face, small, smiling, and innocent, burning in her mind. She moved deeper into the belly of the beast. 2 more sentries guarded the service elevator. They were laughing about a poker hand until Nyla blurred into their peripheral vision. She launched a flying roundhouse that clipped the first man's temple, using the momentum to drive a palm strike into the second man's chin. It was a symphony of kinetic violence, orchestrated with the precision of a woman who had spent half her life in a cage. She reached the heavy oak doors of the VIP wing. Beyond them lay the gilded hall, the seat of Lee Sik-jin's power. She took a breath, settling the adrenaline that threatened to turn into a roar. Nyla didn't knock. She kicked the doors open. The sound of the heavy wood slamming against the marble walls echoed like a cannon blast, cutting through the low hum of jazz and clinking crystal. The elite of Seoul's underworld froze. In the center of the room stood Lee Sok-jin, looking every bit the untouchable king in a suit that cost more than Nyla's life. "Where is she?" Nyla's voice didn't tremble. It vibrated with the threat of a landslide. Seok-jin didn't answer immediately. He looked at her ripped jeans and her bloodied knuckles with a sneer of amused disdain. "You've made a mess of my floor, girl." He gestured to his head of security, a massive enforcer who stepped forward like an encroaching storm. "Land a single hit on him," Seok-jin challenged, his voice dripping with arrogance, "and perhaps I won't have you buried in the foundation of my next hotel." He didn't know he was inviting a hurricane into his house. Nyla centered her weight, her eyes locking onto the boss, and prepared to show him exactly what a champion could do. The silence in the grand hall was absolute, heavy enough to drown out the distant hum of Seoul's traffic. Lee Sok-jin remained frozen against the wall, the fine leather of Nyla's boot still casting a shadow over his face. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. Then, slowly, Nyla retracted her leg, her movements as smooth and controlled as a coiled viper returning to its nest. Seok-jin took a shallow breath, the air whistling through his teeth. He didn't reach for a weapon, and he didn't call for the reinforcements he surely had waiting in the wings. Instead, he reached up with trembling fingers and straightened his silk tie, his composure stitching itself back together like a shroud. He looked at the groaning enforcers on the floor, then back at the woman in the ripped denim. The shock in his eyes hadn't vanished. It had simply evolved into a cold, calculating curiosity. "You fight like a woman who has nothing left to lose," Seok-jin said, his voice regaining its low, melodic edge.
"That makes you either very brave or very stupid."
"I'm the woman who's going to burn this palace down if you don't tell me where my sister is," Nyla countered, her stance never wavering. Sok-jin smoothed the lapel of his tailored suit and gestured toward a set of glass doors at the far end of the hall. "Come. If I wanted you dead, I would have stopped playing fair 5 minutes ago." He led her into a private surveillance suite, a room bathed in the blue glow of a dozen high-definition monitors. With a few sharp strokes on a glass tablet, Sok-jin pulled up a time-stamped video from the night Maya vanished. Nyla's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched a black sedan pull into an alleyway. 3 men emerged, men wearing the distinct jagged crimson emblems of the Red Vipers on their jackets. She watched them drag a struggling Maya into the car. "The Ilhwa do not hide behind masks, and we certainly do not kidnap children for sport," Sok-jin said, his eyes reflecting the digital static. "The Vipers took her to frame me,
hoping to goad me into a war they think I'm too refined to win. They expect a chess match. They don't expect a panther." He turned to her, the lighting making his sharp features look like carved obsidian. "My organization is riddled with shadows I can no longer trust. My own men see my weakness as a weakness. I need a ghost, someone who exists outside my hierarchy, someone who can strike where I cannot." He stepped closer, the scent of expensive cologne and ozone surrounding them. "You want your sister back. I want the vipers dismantled and the traitor in my ranks exposed. Give me your fists, Nyla Daniels. Become my secret weapon, and I will give you the resources of the most powerful man in this city to find Maya." Nyla looked at his extended hand. It was a deal struck in blood and desperation, a bridge across two worlds that should never have met. She reached out, her calloused palm meeting his smooth skin. "Find her," she whispered, "or I'll finish what I started in the hall." Transitioning from a street fighter to a ghost in a palace required a different kind of armor. 2 days after their pact, Nyla stood in a dressing suite that felt more like a museum than a closet. Silk hung from mahogany racks, and velvet cases held high-tech earpieces disguised as diamond studs. For Nyla, who preferred the honest weight of leather and the freedom of denim, the atmosphere was suffocating. Seok-jin stood by the window, silhouetted against the Seoul skyline, watching as a tailor made final adjustments to a deep emerald gown. The fabric was reinforced with lightweight Kevlar, a beautiful lie designed to stop a blade while looking like a dream. "I feel like a bird in a cage," Nyla muttered, tugging at the high slit of the dress that revealed her muscular thigh. "I can't move in this. If I have to throw a roundhouse, I'm going to tear $5,000 worth of silk." "Then tear it," Seok-jin said, turning toward her. His gaze was no longer just the cold assessment of a boss. It was the lingering stare of a man seeing something he hadn't expected. He waved the tailor away, leaving them alone in the quiet luxury of the room. He stepped closer, his eyes dropping to her shoulder, where a jagged, faded scar peeked out from the emerald strap. Without asking, he reached out, his fingers hovering just above the mark. "The cage match in Bangkok?" he asked softly, "or the back alleys of Detroit?" Nyla stiffened, her instinct to strike warring with a sudden jarring vulnerability. "Bangkok, a guy with a hidden razor. He lost the eye, I just lost some skin." Seok-jin's hand moved, tracing the line of a faint white mark on her forearm, a defensive wound from a knife. To anyone else in his world, these were imperfections to be covered with makeup and lace. To him, they were a map of a survivor. He looked at her then, not as a tool or a waitress, but as a mirror. He saw the same hardness in her eyes that he saw in his own every morning, the exhaustion of being the only one who could handle the darkness.
"You hate the protocol," he observed, his thumb grazing the edge of the scar. "The bowing, the silence, the masks we wear. You think it's weakness." "It's fake," Nyla snapped, though she didn't pull away. "It's chess," he corrected. "But tonight, you aren't just a piece on the board. You are the hand that moves them." As he leaned in to fasten a slim, titanium-threaded collar around her neck, a communications device, the space between them vanished. The scent of sandalwood and danger filled her senses. In that moment, the mission felt secondary. The spark was no longer just about a missing sister or a crumbling empire. It was the recognition of two predators who had finally found a match. Nyla caught his gaze in the mirror. For the first time, she didn't see a mafia boss. She saw a warrior who had simply traded his knuckles for a suit. "Ready?" he whispered. Nyla tightened her jaw, the emerald silk shimmering like scales. "Let's go break some hearts
and some bones. The warehouse smelled of rusted river water and cheap diesel, a grim contrast to the silk and sandalwood of the obsidian lotus. From the rusted rafters, Nyla watched the red viper sentry circle a stack of shipping crates. Beside her, Seok-jin sat in the shadows, his presence a cold, steady weight. He didn't carry a heavy weapon. He carried a tablet and a silenced pistol, his mind already 3 moves ahead of the men below. "The server is in the back office," Seok-jin whispered, his voice a ghost against her ear. "The guards are a distraction. I need the data, Nyla, and I need it before they realize we've breached the perimeter." Nyla didn't respond with words. She dropped. She fell like a shadow, landing soundlessly behind the first guard. Before he could turn, she unleashed a flurry of strikes, a low shin kick that buckled his knee, followed by an ascending elbow that shut his lights out. She was the panther now, a blur of kinetic energy and lethal grace. 2 more guards rushed her, their knives gleaming in the dim light. Nyla slipped between them, her movements a violent dance. She caught a wrist, snapped it with a sickening pop, and delivered a spinning back kick that sent the other man crashing into a wall of crates. From the mezzanine, Seok-jin watched with an expression that bordered on reverence. He had seen professional killers, but Nyla was different. She wasn't just efficient, she was elemental. She moved with a raw, street-honed honesty that his world of polished lies lacked. As Nyla cleared a path through the main floor, Seok-jin moved with a predatory elegance of his own. He didn't waste movement. When a survivor tried to pull a hidden firearm, Seok-jin fired a single, precise shot without looking up from his tablet. He reached the server room, his fingers dancing across the keys as he bypassed encryptions that would have baffled a government agency. His intelligence was as sharp as Nyla's shins, a different kind of violence that laid the enemy's secrets bare. "Got it," he muttered, his jaw tightening. Nyla stood at the door, her knuckles split and her breathing heavy, eyes darting for the next threat. "Did you find Maya?" Seok-jin's face went pale in the blue light of the monitor. He didn't answer. He turned the screen toward her. It wasn't just a map of the Viper's territory, it was a log of encrypted communications. The headers didn't belong to a rival gang. They were internal Ilwa codes, protocols only his highest-ranking officers could access. The kidnapping wasn't just a provocation from the Vipers, Seok-jin said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. The coordinates for Maya's snatch and grab were sent from inside my own penthouse. The trail doesn't end with the Vipers, Nyla. It starts with my inner circle. The realization hit like a physical blow. The enemy wasn't just in front of them. They were standing right behind them. The penthouse felt like a gilded cage, but the safe house, a concrete and glass fortress tucked into the jagged cliffs overlooking the Han River, felt like a confessional. Seok-jin had purged their trail, disabling his primary devices and cutting off the Ilwa grid. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum where the noise of the Empire used to be. Every ping of a distant security sensor or flicker of a shadow outside made Seok-jin's jaw tighten. He paced the length of the living area, his tailored shirt unbuttoned at the collar, looking less like a king and more like a man waiting for the floor to drop. Nyla leaned against the kitchen island, her hands wrapped around a glass of water, watching him. The adrenaline from the warehouse raid had cooled into a low, simmering tension. "You can't keep looking at the door, Seok-jin. If they knew we were here, we'd be dead already." "In my world, already is the only time that matters," he replied, stopping his pace. He looked at her, his eyes dark with a weariness that no amount of expensive coffee could mask. The data from the warehouse. It was Director Choi's signature on the encryption, my second in command, my right hand. If he is the architect, then I have no empire. I have a graveyard. He sank into a leather chair, the shadows of the room carving deep lines into his face. For the first time, the calculated mask of the mafia boss slipped, revealing the hollowed-out soul of a man who had been playing a part for too long. They think I covet this power. My mother, my advisors, they think I live for the throne. But I never wanted it, Nyla. I inherited a throne made of bones, and all I've done is try to polish them so they don't look so much like a tragedy. Nyla stepped toward him, the emerald silk of her gown, now torn and stained with the dust of the raid, hissing against the floor. She saw the vulnerability he was offering, a gift more dangerous than any weapon. "We're more alike than I thought," she whispered, stopping just inches from him. "Everyone sees the panther. They see the champion who can take a hit and keep standing. But I'm tired, Seok-jin. I've spent my whole life in a cage, fighting just to prove I can't be broken. I'm tired of being the only one holding the line. I'm tired of being alone in the ring." She reached out, her calloused fingers brushing the back of his hand. Seok-jin didn't pull away. He turned his palm up, interlacing his fingers with hers. The contact was electric, a grounding force in the center of the storm. In the dim light of the safe house, the titles of boss and bodyguard evaporated. They were just two survivors, battered by a world that demanded they be monsters, finding a strange, desperate peace in each other's shadows. The air between them thickened, the silence no longer heavy with paranoia, but with the realization that they were no longer fighting separate wars. For the first time, the darkness felt like home. The lead was too perfect. A jagged piece of hope dangled in the dark. An encrypted tip, supposedly from a remorseful low-level viper, placed Maya in a disused shipyard on the edge of the Incheon docks. Against the screaming instincts that had kept her alive in the ring, Nyla pushed for the strike. She couldn't wait any longer. The thought of her sister in a cold cellar was a blade twisting in her gut. Seok-jin didn't argue. He simply checked his weapon, his eyes reflecting the grim resolve of a man who would burn his own kingdom to the ground if it meant keeping her safe. They moved through the shipyard like twin ghosts, the fog rolling off the yellow sea to swallow the skeletons of rusted cranes. But as they reached the central warehouse, the silence didn't feel like cover, it felt like a shroud. "Nyla, stop," Seok-jin hissed, his hand catching her elbow. Before she could react, the darkness detonated. Floodlights roared to life, blinding and predatory. From the catwalks above, the sharp, rhythmic crack of suppressed gunfire shattered the night. Seok-jin lunged, throwing his body weight against Nyla to shove her behind a steel shipping container. A grunt of agony escaped his lips, a sound that made Nyla's world tilt on its axis. "Seok-jin!" Blood, dark and hot, was already blossoming across the shoulder of his charcoal suit. He slumped against the corrugated metal, his teeth bared in a snarl of pain. It's a setup," he gasped, his hand clutching the wound. From the shadows emerged Director Choi, his expression as sterile and cold as a surgical theater. He wasn't alone. Dozens of red vipers and traitorous Ilwa soldiers materialized from the fog, their weapons leveled with terrifying precision.
"You've become sentimental, Seok-jin," Choi's voice echoed. "It's a fatal flaw for a king." Nyla didn't wait for the command. She exploded from behind the container, a whirlwind of desperation and fury. She fought like a demon possessed, her shins cracking against ribs and her fists finding throats. She moved with a speed that defied the heavy air, a blur of emerald silk and lethal intent. She took down 3, 4, 5 men, her roar of defiance echoing off the shipping crates. But the numbers were insurmountable. A heavy blow from a rifle butt caught her across the temple, sending spots dancing in her vision. She went to one knee, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked back at Seok Jin. 2 soldiers had dragged him upright, a pistol pressed hard against his temple. "Enough," Choi shouted. "One more move from the panther and the king loses his head." Nyla froze. The fire in her veins turned to ice. She looked at Seok Jin, his pale face, his blood-soaked shirt, the way he looked at her with a plea to keep fighting. But she couldn't, not if it cost him his life. Slowly, Nyla raised her bloodied hands. "Don't hurt him," she rasped, her voice breaking. "Take her," Choi commanded. As they dragged her toward a waiting van, Nyla's last sight was Seok Jin collapsing to the ground, his eyes locked onto hers, as the darkness finally reclaimed them both. The air in the dungeon was thick with the smell of damp concrete and rust, a far cry from the sandalwood and silk that now defined her memory of Seok Jin. Nyla was chained to a rusted radiator, her wrists raw from the jagged iron. But the physical pain was a distant hum compared to the sight across the room. There, huddled in the corner of a cage, was Maya. Her sister looked small, terrified, but alive. The heavy steel door groaned open, and Director Choi stepped into the dim light, his pristine suit a jarring insult to the filth of the room. He leaned down, his eyes scanning Nyla with the detached curiosity of a scientist dissecting an insect. "Where did he hide the ledgers, Nyla?" Choi asked, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "Seok Jin is dead, or he will be by dawn. You're protecting a ghost. Tell me what I want to know, and I'll let the girl go." Nyla looked at him, a slow, predatory grin spreading across her bloodied face. "You think a suit makes you a monster, Choi. I've spent my life fighting real monsters in cages smaller than this." Choi sighed, turning to leave. "I'll give you an hour, then I start with the girl's fingers." The moment the door slammed shut, Nyla's focus narrowed to a singular sharp point. Choi thought she was a victim. He forgot she was a champion. While they had searched her for weapons, they hadn't checked the lining of her torn emerald gown. She reached into a hidden seam, pulling out a slim, titanium-threaded lockpick Seok Jin had taught her to use during their nights in the safe house. Her fingers worked with mechanical precision, fueled by a cold, incandescent rage. They had taken her sister. They had shot the only man who had ever truly seen her. The lock clicked, a small sound that echoed like a thunderclap in her heart. She slipped her restraints and moved across the floor like a shadow. With a single brutal kick, she shattered the padlock on Maya's cage.
"Don't scream," Nyla whispered, pulling her sister into a fierce embrace. "I've got you. Close your eyes and hold on to my waist. We're leaving." Nyla didn't sneak out. She tore her way out. When the first guard opened the door to check on the prisoner, she met him with a rising knee that shattered his jaw. She intercepted his fallen baton in midair, spinning it into a lethal extension of her own fury. She moved through the corridors of the Viper's Nest like a whirlwind, a blur of kinetic violence and protective instinct. She didn't just fight, she decimated. Every strike was for Maya, and every broken bone was for Seok Jin. By the time she reached the exit, the hallway was a graveyard of Choi's ambitions. Nyla stood in the cool night air, her knuckles split and her dress stained red, looking back at the fortress she had just dismantled. She had her sister. Now she was going back for her king. The safe house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a war room fueled by desperation and the copper scent of blood. Seok Jin stood hunched over a topographical map of the docks, his left arm bound tightly in a makeshift sling that was rapidly blooming crimson. His face was a mask of pale fury, his eyes burning with a fire that transcended his physical agony. Around him stood the few who remained, Young-ho and a handful of scarred loyalists who chose honor over Choi's promised gold. "We don't have the numbers for a siege," Young-ho muttered, his voice heavy with the reality of their situation. "It's a suicide run, boss." "Then prepare to die," Seok-jin rasped, his voice a serrated blade. "Because I am not leaving her in that hell. If I have to walk through the fire myself to drag Choi to the grave, I will." He reached for a heavy tactical vest, his teeth bared in a snarl of pain as he tried to pull it over his wounded shoulder. He was a king without a crown, a man stripped of his empire, holding on to nothing but the ghost of Nyla's touch. The heavy security door hissed open. Seok-jin spun, his pistol raised with trembling precision, only to freeze. Nyla stood in the threshold. She was a vision of beautiful, terrible carnage. Her emerald gown was shredded to the thigh, her skin was mapped in bruises and grime, and her knuckles were raw. But her stance was unbreakable. Tucked under her arm, wide-eyed but safe, was Maya. The pistol slipped from Seok-jin's hand, clattering to the floor. For a heartbeat, the ruthless boss disappeared, replaced by a man who had just seen a miracle. "Nyla," he breathed, the word a prayer. She didn't collapse. She stepped into the room, handing Maya to a stunned Young-ho. She walked straight to Seok-jin, her gaze searching his face, tracking the blood on his shirt. She reached out, her fingers grazing his jaw with a touch that was both a caress and a promise of war. "I told you I'd finish what I started," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Choi thinks he's won. He's at the Obsidian Lotus right now, sitting in your chair, drinking your wine." Seok-jin felt the strength return to his limbs, the pain in his shoulder receding behind a wall of cold, incandescent purpose. He looked at her, his partner, his equal, the woman who had walked through a dungeon to find her way back to him. "He's sitting in our chair," Seok-jin corrected. He picked up a fresh magazine, slamming it into his weapon with a definitive click. The time of hiding was over. The king had returned, and he had brought the panther with him. Together, they turned toward the door, ready to take back the night with blood and fire. The Obsidian Lotus was no longer a place of quiet luxury. It was a cathedral of smoke and shattering glass. The heavy oak doors of the grand hall, the same doors Nyla had kicked open a lifetime ago, now buckled under the weight of Seok-jin's final assault. Director Choi sat at the head of the long marble table, a glass of vintage scotch in his hand, looking every bit the usurper. Beside him stood the Viper's primary enforcer, a hulking brute whose neck was thicker than Nyla's waist. "The king and his stray," Choi mocked, though his grip on the glass tightened. "You should have died in the fog." "I don't die easily," Seok-jin rasped, his eyes fixed solely on Choi. "And I don't forget a debt." The room erupted, Seok-jin, moving with a cold, surgical ferocity, despite his wounded shoulder, drew his weapon to hunt the man who had traded his loyalty for a crown of ash. Nyla didn't follow him. She had a mountain to move. The enforcer lunged, a massive fist whistling past her ear. Nyla didn't retreat. She leaned into the chaos, her Muay Thai training taking over. She was a blur of emerald silk and savage precision, her elbows finding the soft tissue of his ribs, her knees crashing into his thighs. He was stronger, but she was faster, fueled by a rage that had been simmering since the moment Maya was taken. With a defiant roar, she launched a flying knee that connected squarely with his jaw, the impact echoing like a gavel. He hit the marble floor with a finality that shook the chandeliers. Across the room, Seok-jin had cornered Choi near the tall windows. There was no grand speech, no mercy. A single muffled crack of a pistol ended the traitor's reign before it had truly begun. Silence returned to the lotus, thick and smelling of cordite.
Seok-jin turned to find Nyla standing amidst the wreckage, her breathing heavy, her eyes searching for his. He walked toward her, his silhouette framed by the rising sun of a new day. In his hand he held a small white envelope. He stopped before her, his gaze soft and heartbreakingly vulnerable. "There is a private jet waiting at Incheon," he said softly, handing her the envelope. "A ticket to anywhere in the world for you and Maya. No more fighting, no more shadows. You've earned your peace, Nyla." Nyla looked at the ticket, then at the man who had bled beside her. She didn't hesitate. She took the paper and tore it into a dozen pieces, letting them fall like snow onto the bloodied marble. "I'm done running," she said. She reached down, picking up her scorched black leather jacket from the floor and sliding it over her emerald silk gown. It was a jarring, perfect image, the street fighter and the queen. She walked to the throne at the head of the hall and stood beside Seok-jin. He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, his strength anchoring her. They looked out over the empire they had broken and rebuilt in a single night. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were the new order. Together, they ruled the darkness. Together, they were home. I am pleased that we all reached this point. Wishing you a happy new year.